Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
It started with the kind of evening that looks harmless from the outside, wine glasses glinting under soft light, the smell of roasted chicken and rosemary drifting through a kitchen that had seen too many staged holidays to ever feel warm. I was home for Sunday dinner, a ritual that seemed to mean something only to my parents, and even then, mostly to my mother, who still believed a family gathered around a table could erase years of unspoken things. My sister Rachel sat across from me, her perfect posture, her diamond ring catching the light each time she lifted her fork. She was already mid-story before I had even sat down, describing how her son had just been accepted into some advanced reading program. Dad smiled faintly, the way he always did when Rachel spoke, half proud, half trying not to look at me. I poured myself water instead of wine. I learned long ago that alcohol only made it harder to stay quiet. Mom leaned over, asked if I was still working at that office job, like it was a temporary phase I had forgotten to grow out of. I said yes, and she smiled politely, as though humoring a child who still believed in fairy tales. Rachel jumped in, talking about her husband's new company car and how it's about time hard work paid off. I kept my eyes on the chicken, cutting it carefully, wondering if anyone could hear how hard my fork pressed into the plate. Mom topped off Rachel's glass, then turned toward me with that bright, proud expression she reserved for when Rachel said something worth repeating. "Your sister's the one we can brag about," she said, casual, soft even, but sharp enough to slice through the air. For a second, nobody moved. Dad cleared his throat. Rachel shifted, probably aware that the air had just changed. I smiled, the kind of smile that stretches a little too far. "Guess I'll start doing something worth a brag soon," I said lightly, my voice sounding almost amused, like I was in on the joke. Mom nodded, seemingly satisfied that I'd taken it well. But something inside me folded, like a corner of paper you can't smooth out again. Dinner dragged on after that. The conversation moved on to vacation plans and Rachel's new patio renovation, while I silently refilled water glasses and gathered empty plates. I've always been the cleaner, the helper, the one who kept things moving while everyone else reminisced about good old times I apparently wasn't part of. When I stood to clear the dishes, Dad muttered a quiet, "Thanks, sweetheart," without meeting my eyes. I think he thought gratitude was enough to balance silence. In the kitchen, the hum of the dishwasher drowned out the clinking of plates. I stared at my reflection in the window, a woman who looked calm, maybe even indifferent, but whose chest burned like something had been simmering there for years and had finally boiled over. I thought of all the years I spent shrinking myself down to fit into this family shape, Rachel's achievements, Mom's pride, Dad's neutrality. Somewhere along the line, I'd mistaken being tolerated for being loved. When I came back to the table, Rachel was showing Mom photos of her kids' piano recital. "They played flawlessly," Mom said. "It's like they have your talent." Rachel laughed modestly. I stood there, holding the last dish towel, wondering when exactly they decided I was the comparison point for mediocrity. I wanted to say something cruel, something final, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Words never stuck to people who refused to hear them. So I said nothing. I just watched them, memorizing the scene, the plates, the laughter, the light bouncing off Rachel's ring, Mom's content expression, Dad's uneasy quiet. Then I put the towel down, leaned over, and kissed my mother on the cheek. "Dinner was great," I said. "You've outdone yourself." She smiled, pleased, because politeness is a language she understands. As I walked to the door, Rachel called after me, "You're leaving already?" I said I had an early morning. She told me not to be such a stranger. It was her favorite phrase, pretending distance was a coincidence. Outside, the night air felt like a reprieve. I stood beside my car for a moment, watching the light from the dining room spill across the driveway. It looked almost like a stage set, and for once, I wasn't in the scene. I started the car and drove off without turning on the radio. The quiet was heavy, but it was mine. Halfway home, my phone buzzed. A message from Rachel. "Sorry about Mom. You know how she is." I stared at it for a while, thumb hovering over the screen, before I put the phone face down on the passenger seat. I didn't need her sympathy. What I needed was distance. When I got home, I poured myself a drink, just one, and sat on the couch in the dark. The silence was thick, like it knew what I was thinking before I did. Somewhere deep inside, under all that calm, something shifted. I wasn't angry exactly. Anger implies fire, and what I felt was colder than that, quiet, deliberate, almost peaceful. I thought of the photo albums stacked in Mom's attic, the ones I'd organized when Dad's back went out, the ones filled with family stories told from one point of view. I thought of the emails I'd helped her set up years ago, the ones Rachel still used for family updates. And I thought about how much truth hides in plain sight if anyone ever bothers to look. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and whispered to no one, that was the last dinner. The next morning, the sun rose pale and uninviting. My phone buzzed again, this time from Aunt Linda. Your mom's shattered and silent. What happened? I stared at the message for a long time before I smiled. Not the polite kind, not the practiced one. Just a quiet, knowing smile that didn't need to explain itself. I did not sleep after that message from Aunt Linda, because sleep felt like a luxury for people who could still pretend their families were fine, so I made tea that I did not need and stood in the kitchen with the window cracked and the city exhaling somewhere below. And, while the kettle clicked and the apartment hummed, I let myself take inventory, not of feelings, because those were noisy and unreliable, but of facts, of the countless small proofs that I had given and they had pocketed, the rides to appointments when Dad's shoulder locked up, the bills that arrived in pale envelopes addressed to my mother, but paid from my accounts, the nights I held my breath in hallways so I wouldn't say the kind of words that can't be taken back. And I thought how convenient it had been for everyone that I was the quiet one who remembered passwords and set up backups and labeled folders with dates and places and names because somebody had to. On a shelf in my bedroom, tucked behind a stack of cookbooks I had never opened because cooking for one always felt like a dare, sat an old laptop with stickers peeling at the edges, the machine I used when Mom decided she wanted the photos organized like normal people do, and I remembered the shared family email I created so she could forward grandkid pictures without breaking the chain, an address simple enough that even Aunt Linda could remember it, and I remembered that no one had ever changed the recovery number from mine, because no one ever changed anything I built until it broke and needed me again, so I turned on the laptop, entered the recovery flow, and there it was, the door I had once installed and they had never bothered to lock. The inbox was a museum of their priorities. Newsletters from charity galas Rachel attended in shoes that pinched, school notices about bake sales that somehow became my assignments when a last-minute emergency came up. Notes from Mom asking me to fix the printer, the thermostat, the internet, and then, threaded among the mundane, a few small veins of private messages Rachel had forwarded to Mom with little crowns on them in her tone. The ones where she carefully curated the legend of the daughter who handled everything, the story in which she negotiated medical billing like a warrior queen and covered the remainder because Claire has enough, and the matching receipts where the charge came from my card. The familiar company names and the exact amounts I remembered from late-night logins when I told myself it wasn't generosity so much as damage control, because if I didn't do it then I would end up hearing about it anyway. I did not feel rage while I dragged those emails into a neat folder called Album Candidates, and I did not feel pity while I searched old messages for the photo of me hauling the portable air conditioner up their stairs one humid August after Rachel announced she had a headache and vanished into her car. Mostly I felt a procedure clicking into place, the way you follow a recipe that has lived in your hands for years, step after step, combine the receipts with the photographs, attach the dates, add a simple line of context that contained no adjectives and no accusations, only specifics that could stand on their own without me holding them upright. Humor visited me like an old friend when I found the thread where Rachel, after a glass or too many at some fundraiser, joked about how Mom would lose her head if it weren't attached, followed by a winking face and a story about hiding Mom's keys to teach her a lesson about organizing, and I thought, not for the first time, that the universe had a petty streak when it came to the way truth archived itself, because nothing I could write would ever sound as damning as the things they had already chosen to send to each other. I made a single document, not flashy, Not dramatic, a tidy sheet with dates in full words, a line or two of description, and links to the emails and scans, and I titled it the way Mom titled her photo books when she used to print them at the drugstore. Family album, what we don't brag about, and I placed it in a shared drive that already existed because Rachel had begged me, years ago, to make one so Mom stops exploding our phones, and then I composed an email from the family address with a subject that could pass for nostalgia, memories worth keeping, and I wrote, in the same cordial voice I used to send birthday reminders, that I had gathered a few items for the record, that everyone might like to add whatever I missed. That it would be nice if the album reflected what actually happened and not just what photographed well. I did not sign my name, because I did not need the credit and I definitely did not need the conversation, and I did not attach accusations, because I had finally learned that truth does not need a megaphone when it can simply turn on the lights. I addressed the message to Mom, to Dad, to Aunt Linda, and to Rachel, and before I hovered over the send button, I let myself imagine the dinner table again, the reflected lights, the ring on Rachel's finger, the sentence that cut and then cauterized. And I realized, with a calm that felt almost clinical, that this was not me torching the house, but me opening a window and letting the smoke drift where it belonged. When I clicked send, the laptop made a small sound like a snap of static, and for a moment nothing happened, and then the read receipt from Aunt Linda pinged, followed by one from Dad, and finally the bolded subject on Mom's mailbox faded to regular text. And the quiet in my apartment changed shape, as if the walls had leaned in to listen. My phone lit up face down on the table, Rachel's name chewing its way across the screen alongside Dad's shorter, more careful text, and, while both notifications stacked like coasters, I remembered the iron rule of my family, that whoever told the truth first would be the villain for ruining the mood, which made me laugh in a way that didn't sound kind. For the first time in years, I felt the ground under my feet instead of the old habit of tiptoeing, and because revenge tastes better when it is served cold and labeled as documentation, I set a quiet filter in that shared account to auto-forward any reply that contained the word brag or credit or repay into the same family inbox, so that whatever rewriting began would be archived with the rest of the exhibits. And then I stood in the doorway of my dark kitchen watching the kettle's ghostly plume drift into nothing while my phone vibrated again, this time with a single message from Rachel that did not bother with sorry or explanation, only 4 words spelled out with the anxious grammar of a cornered storyteller. What did you do? And before I could decide whether to answer, a new line appeared under it, gray bubbles pulsing, my mother typing. When the gray bubbles under my mother's name pulsed and then vanished without delivering a single word, I realized that silence, for her, had always been less the absence of sound and more a performance choice, which, ironically, made it the loudest response she could have offered. So I put the phone down and walked through my apartment with the kind of measured calm that arrives after a storm you knew was coming, and I let myself consider the rules of our family the way a lawyer reads boilerplate, because if I was going to stop being the unpaid custodian of their mess, I was at least going to make the exit neat, traceable, and almost boring in its clarity. The shared inbox pinged with an automatic notification about new collaborators in the Memories Worth Keeping folder, a small, efficient confirmation that Aunt Linda had opened the document and, characteristically, had already forwarded it to her daughter for safekeeping, which, in our family's vernacular, usually meant, I want an audience in case the fireworks go off, and while the polite chorus of read receipts stacked up, I scrolled through my mother's contact groups. The tidy lists I had built for her when she decided she wanted to keep Christmas cards updated and prayer chain texts brisk, and I saw the familiar clusters, bridge night, book club, neighbors, church ladies, and the tiny folder labeled emergency, which was supposed to be for medical contacts and trusted relatives, but, thanks to a decade of mom logic and Rachel's creative delegations, also included the vice principal who adored Rachel's kids, the HOA secretary who never missed a rumor, and the church treasurer who oversaw the directory that might as well have been a small-town newswire. What occurred to me then was not vengeance dipped in gasoline and matches, because I had never been the type to enjoy flames, but something cooler and more durable, the kind of gift wrap that refuses to tear even when someone tries to shred it with impatient nails. So I drafted a calm, almost bland message from the family account addressed to the emergency group that read like a practical update shared by a responsible daughter who wanted the truth on file, that a consolidated album of receipts, caregiving dates, and correspondence had been prepared and placed in the family drive so that if Mom needed assistance with insurance questions or calendar history, anyone in the inner circle would have a single, clean reference to consult. And, because I was not in the business of slander, I added that attachments spoke for themselves and that if anyone noticed gaps they were welcome to add what they possessed, since accuracy helps everyone when stress is high, which Americans who have ever juggled Medicare statements, pharmacy mix-ups, and wayward EOBs understand without being told. Before sending, I did one more thing that made me feel both clinical and a little wicked in a librarian sort of way. I took screenshots of the last 5 years of my bank app's recurring payments labeled Mom, which included pharmacy deliveries, winter oil fills, and one memorable month where the dental plan forgot to process a crown and the bill landed like a bowling ball, and I embedded the images into the album under a section called Standing Support for reference, a phrase so neutral it could pass for HR jargon, and then, in a gesture that felt like flicking on fluorescence in a room everyone preferred to keep dim, I added a line that read, Primary funding source, Claire, followed by the dates and amounts written in full words. Because I knew that Rachel hated two things above all else, receipts, and the kind of numbers that leave no room for a pretty anecdote. The email went out with the same modest chime my laptop used for grocery coupons, and almost instantly the replies began to braid into a rope I could hang my calm on, because the church treasurer wrote back a polite, "Thank you for organizing." The HOA secretary asked if Mom needed meal deliveries for a week while things settle, and Aunt Linda, who finally understood the gift she had been handed, texted me privately to say that Mom had opened the folder twice and then closed it without comment, which in Margaret Donovan language translates to a small earthquake that made the china rattle without breaking a single plate. Rachel, to her credit, did not storm my door with tears and accusations, which would have been her usual preference. Instead, she called, hung up, called again, and finally left a voicemail where her voice sounded like sweet tea poured over ice that never melts, telling me that I had misunderstood arrangements, that Mom never wanted you burdened, and that this isn't the kind of thing guests need to see. And while her words stacked, I stared at my ceiling fan and thought how fascinating it is that people who curate narratives for sport always call the truth bad optics once it makes contact with daylight. The small revenge I allowed myself, and I admit it was small only in the sense that it did not involve shouting, arrived when I scheduled a second message to the book club group. Women who had known my mother for decades and who kept each other alive with casseroles and careful honesty, where I thanked them for being present during a tough week and included a link to a subfolder marked Medical Timeline, which would, if they opened it, show the actual sequence of who drove where and who paid what and who sat in which waiting room while humming along to the pharmacy's radio, and I signed the note not with my name but with the family account, because anonymity, when wrapped around truth, works like a mirror you hold up and leave behind. By the time early afternoon stretched across my living room, Dad had sent me a text with more words than he normally deployed in a month, asking if we could talk before this grows legs, which made me smile because it already had legs. And they were marching politely through every room that had once been closed off to me, and as I typed back that I was free after dinner and could meet at the grocery store cafe he likes because the coffee refills are cheap, a different notification slid over the top of his message, a simple one-line email from the church treasurer that said, "Claire, your mom asked for a printout of the album. Should I bring it by tonight?" And I realized that the quiet night I had spent staging facts like place settings had worked better than any speech I could have delivered, because now the story had left my mouth and walked into the places that shaped hers. I closed the laptop, let the room go still, and promised myself I would not gloat, not even in the privacy of my own head, since gloating turns clean work into something sticky. Instead, I took a slow breath and acknowledged the satisfaction that comes from setting the record where records belong, and only then did I permit one last nudge of the wheel, the kind of bow that ties the gift and keeps fingers from slipping it off, by adding a rule to the family inbox that automatically forwarded any reply containing the phrase "keep this between us" into the shared album under a new section called Edits Requested, which meant that anyone who tried to corral the truth back into the shadows would find their hands, very gently, held up to the light. The phone buzzed once more. A new text from Aunt Linda that landed like a pebble thrown against a window. "Your mom hasn't said your name, but she asked me where you learned to keep records that clean," and, before I could type a response, another message stacked beneath it. This time from an unknown number that turned out to be the HOA secretary, asking whether Mom would want the neighborhood to organize a rotating ride list, since Rachel mentioned she has her hands full, and I looked at that phrasing, "has her hands full," and thought, with a private, uncharitable humor, that finally the hands doing the lifting had names attached, which, given our household religion of bragging rights, felt like the most appropriate hymn I could have chosen. By the time I met Dad at the grocery store cafe, the one with the mismatched mugs and the polite cashier who pretends not to hear when regulars argue softly about coupons, the memories worth keeping album had already made 2 laps around the small world my parents chose to live in, and the replies, polite on their surface and barbed beneath, had braided themselves into a rope long enough to measure the distance between what my family liked to say and what actually happened. So when Dad slid into the seat across from me with that tired, apologetic smile he wears like an old sweater, I watched the way he cupped his coffee and decided not to punish him for being the kind of man who prefers weather to truth. Because I had come for something more useful than an apology that would curdle on the walk to the car. He cleared his throat and said he knew I had meant well, that I always meant well, and that things had simply gotten bigger than intended, which, in our family's dictionary, means people started reading, and then he asked if maybe, just for the sake of peace, we could take the album down and let him handle it with Mom and Rachel once feelings settled, and I sat there with the cheap mug warming my hands and thought that if I let him, the truth would be wrapped in tissue paper and slid back into the drawer where fragile things go to outlive their usefulness. So I told him calmly that the album stayed, because facts do not misbehave when left in daylight, and that the only edit I was willing to consider would be an addition. Specifically a 1-page statement signed by Mom acknowledging the contributions made by both daughters over the years and posted, with her permission, to the Church Care Bulletin so that the next time donations were collected or rides organized the right phones would ring, and although he winced at the word posted, he did not argue that it was unfair, which, for my father, is a full-throated endorsement. He asked whether this was revenge, and I said if it were, it would burn hotter and die faster, whereas this felt more like a thermostat finally set to the temperature that keeps a house from molding, and he stared into his coffee. Then nodded in that small way he does when he accepts a reality that will scold him if he looks at it too directly. He promised to talk to Mom, to give her time, to remind her that accuracy isn't cruelty. And as we stood to leave, he squeezed my shoulder with a pressure that carried years of unsaid thank yous, which I accepted without pretending it changed the ledger. Rachel, predictably, chose theater over conversation and showed up at my apartment that evening with hair perfectly set and eyes already shining, the entrance of a woman who believes sincerity can be summoned by lighting and eyeliner. And before I could offer a seat, she began to explain that I had humiliated Mom, that I had invited strangers into private matters, that the album would follow our family for years because the internet never forgets, and I let her speak. Because interrupting only gives people more oxygen, and when she finally paused, I told her I had shared nothing untrue, that privacy does not mean secrecy, and that if she wished to correct the record, she could do it by adding her own receipts and dates, which would be reviewed by the same aunts and neighbors she had toured through her children's recitals and patio renovations without ever once asking whether Mom's air conditioning worked in July. She said it was tacky to put money amounts in front of people who bake casseroles, and I replied that money amounts are the difference between casseroles and actual groceries, and then, Because I am not a saint, and because revenge tastes best when it's confused with customer service, I handed her a neatly printed sheet titled Proposed Amendment, which contained the exact language Dad and I had discussed. An acknowledgement of shared care and a commitment to transparent coordination moving forward, along with a line suggesting that Rachel's recent claim of covering Mom's prescription gap had been an error in memory, now corrected by the attached statements, an inclusion I justified by pointing to her own forwarded messages, preserved in the album, where she had joked about Mom misplacing facts, a detail that made Rachel whiten in a way no blush could hide. She demanded to know whether I had sent the album to her husband's parents or to the school board or to anyone who might consider it a reflection of her household, and I said no, because I did not need an audience that large to accomplish what I wanted. Which was not her embarrassment, but the end of a story that had never included my name in the right places. She said Mom had barely spoken since the morning, that she drifted from room to room picking things up without setting them down, and that Dad looked older than their wedding album, and for a moment I felt the kind of ache that makes a person put out a hand and ruin their own boundary. So I stayed where I was and told Rachel to sign the paper, to bring it to Mom, to let the truth exist without a fight. And then I added, almost gently, that stories are lighter when everyone carries the part they authored. After she left, taking the unsigned amendment and a silence that felt like a draft under a door, my phone lit up with a string of messages from numbers I barely recognized, neighbors and book club friends, and the woman from church who organizes funeral lilies. All of them asking whether they could add notes to the timeline because they remembered rides, checks, and afternoons spent in waiting rooms where I had waved them off with a thank you and a joke about owing them coffee, and as I typed short permissions and watched the album populate with their small, steady truths, a new email surfaced at the top of the inbox, the subject written in my mother's exacting punctuation, regarding this album, and for a long breath I could not open it. Because the weight of a lifetime can be folded into a single line if the sender understands the economy of damage, and when I finally clicked, there was no text body at all, only a scanned image of an envelope addressed in her hand to my childhood. Nickname, the flap unsealed and the paper inside just visible, and beneath the image, one sentence that was not a sentence so much as a summons, please come by before dark. When I pulled into the driveway just before the sky slid from bruised lavender into the plain gray that sits over our town when evening decides it is done being sentimental, the porch light was already on and the front door stood open to the length of the chain, which was my mother's way of saying both welcome and not so fast, so I stood on the mat with my hands empty, listening to the small, domestic noises that had trained me since childhood, the far-off hum of the refrigerator doing its square dance, the rhythmic click of the mantel clock my grandfather wound every Sunday after church, the soft shuffle of slippers that told me she had begun and then abandoned a task, and I said her name once, deliberately calm, and waited while she undid the chain and looked at me with eyes that had known exactly where to look for my mistakes and almost never found them because I had always been too careful to leave one out in the open. She did not ask me inside with words so much as with the tilt of her head toward the kitchen, a room that smelled faintly of lemons and something scorched, and on the table, beside a perfectly centered placemat, lay the envelope from the scanned image, addressed in her unhurried hand to the nickname I had outgrown in middle school and fought to bury in college, the flap loose and the paper half slid out like a tongue that refused to lie, and when I did not sit she gestured to the chair, and when I did sit she said, without preface or pretense, that the album had been cruel, and then, almost in the same breath, that it had been correct, which made the next silence feel like the air after lightning has stitched a seam you cannot see, but can smell. I told her that truth refuses to be polite when it has been asked to apologize for years, and she told me, with a steadiness that reminded me of the way she iced cakes with a knife held at the exact angle learned in church kitchens, that she had known in the way mothers know who sleeps and who pretends to sleep when the house groans, that I had paid and driven and arranged and said nothing, and that she had allowed it to be convenient because convenience feels so close to love when you are tired, And then she slid the paper from the envelope toward me with 2 fingers, as if pushing a small boat into water, and said she had written it last winter during a week when the heating oil ran low and my father coughed through the nights. A letter to me that began as a thank you and turned at the last paragraph into an argument with herself about why she could not say what needed saying while Rachel lived in the next chapter of every conversation, and the paper was creased where her fingers had folded and unfolded it, and the ink had bled in 2 places where the pen had paused too long, and the final line did not end with a period so much as with a sudden loss of nerve. I told her she could put the period on the church bulletin by signing the acknowledgement and letting the care list rotate toward the daughter who had been raised on public applause, and she looked toward the hallway where the family gallery hangs, those frames that insist on chronology as moral proof, and she said that if she signed a page she could not unsign it in her heart, which was not so much a refusal as a confession of limits, and I discovered, with an irritation I tried to fold into something kinder, that I wanted from her not only the signature but also the part of motherhood that turns, belatedly but decisively, into taking my side without requiring me to provide minutes and exhibits. I did not threaten, because threat is for people who plan on repeating themselves, and I did not plead, because pleading is what you do when you expect to come back, so I opened my tote, not for a grenade, but for the quiet instruments I had brought as if I were a field medic finally labeling a body correctly, the bound contacts and costs book I had compiled that afternoon from the album, written in large clean letters that even Aunt Linda could read without holding the page at arm's length, with calendars for refills and maintenance calls, and all the numbers that matter in a house that runs on habit, and I lifted the spare keys from the ceramic bowl by the door, the set my mother had pressed into my palm when Dad first scared us with a fall, and I placed them on top of the binder, and I said that starting tonight the auto-pays and recurring charges tied to my accounts had been shut off and replaced by her card on file with the pharmacy and the oil company, that the grocery delivery schedule had been shifted to a neighbors and church rotation already organized by the same people who know how to carry a casserole without spilling and a secret without curdling, and that the first number listed under primary contact for every category was Rachel's, because bragging, when translated into work, becomes the kind of resume the town can finally read. She sat very still, which is how she processes a blow that arrives like paperwork rather than a punch, and then she reached into the drawer where she keeps rubber bands and birthday candles, and, in some cruelly practical compartment of the same mind, grief. And she took out the label maker I had given her years ago and never saw her use, and without looking at me she typed slowly and pressed print and peeled and affixed a neat white strip to the spine of the binder that said, "Help," which felt, oddly, like a ceremony neither of us knew how to officiate, and when she slid the binder into the end of the pantry shelf, beside the cookbooks that make casseroles sound like policy, I felt something unclench in my shoulders that had held since I was old enough to carry a purse and a plan. Before I left I taped, inside the pantry door at eye level, a single sheet that read in full words and plain instructions where to find everything and who to call first, second, and third, and I kissed her temple. And I told her I would answer if she called, but that the first call should not be mine, because even God, in our zip code, expects people to try the usual channels before dialing the emergency line. And she drew in a breath that sounded like a beginning and an ending at once, and she said nothing, which, for my mother, is either surrender or a sentence she intends to complete later. The next morning the church treasurer texted a photo of the bulletin board with a typed notice about the new care rotation and a handwritten note at the bottom that said, "Thank you to all who give, seen and unseen." And Dad sent a message that contained only a picture of the mantel clock, newly wound. And Rachel called twice without leaving a voicemail, and then posted a chirpy update about the importance of community that fooled no one who has ever bought a Costco sheet cake for a neighbor at the last minute, and Aunt Linda wrote, in the simple grammar of mercy, that Mom had come to book club and sat through most of it and took home a stack of recipes, as if recipes were lifelines, and that she kept touching the pantry door like a person checking the pulse of a sleeping child. Whether I engineered a disaster or released a pressure valve depends on who tells it at Thanksgiving, and I have made peace with the fact that the seat where I used to hide will be filled by someone more comfortable with the spotlight's heat, and that my revenge, such as it is, will look to outsiders like administration rather than fire, which is fine, because the best kind of reckoning is the sort that continues after the credits when the audience has to talk to each other about what should have happened, and whether the quiet one should have stayed quiet a little longer, and whether love without acknowledgement can be called love at all. I drove past the house at dusk and saw the porch light burn steadily against the mild dark, and I imagined the binder sitting where I left it, labeled with the word my mother finally chose for herself. And I wondered if she would add the period to the letter or leave it as a line that anyone might finish, and I understood, with the same cold clarity that carried me through the album and the emails and the binder and the pantry sheet, that the question Aunt Linda sent me on that first morning had never stopped ringing under everything, what happened, and that the answer, for once, did not fit in a story anyone could brag about without changing the ending.